In the middle of London, on a patch of ground the size of a small town, stands a square lined with white stucco townhouses, foreign embassies, and a private garden locked behind iron railings that only one family has ever held the key to. For 349 years, nobody has been allowed to buy the ground underneath it. Not a king, not a prime minister, not a Russian oligarch with a checkbook the size of a small nation's budget. You can rent a flat there for 6 figures a year, in the leasehold arrangement the British call a long lease. But the earth itself, the freehold, has never once changed hands outside a single bloodline. This is Mayfair. 2 streets over is Belgravia. The same story. Together they add up to roughly 300 acres of the most expensive real estate on the planet, and all of it still belongs, today, in the year you are watching this, to the descendants of one 12-year-old girl. Her name was Mary Davies, and in 1701, 1 year after her husband died, she came within a single court ruling of losing every acre of it to a stranger she had known for 3 weeks. This is not a story about a fortune that was lost. This is the one where it almost was, and the reason it was not is the same reason nobody else has ever managed to hold 3 centuries of London real estate in one pair of hands. Somewhere between a bedroom in Paris and a courtroom in Westminster, this family discovered the mechanism that every other dynasty in this kind of story never finds in time. Here is the number to hold on to while we get there. Today, the head of this family, a man named Hugh Grosvenor, the 7th Duke of Westminster, is worth somewhere close to £10 billion, and he was worth most of that before he turned 30. He did not build a company. He did not invent a product. He inherited the same 300 acres his ancestors have refused to sell since the reign of Charles II, and the land alone still throws off more money in a single year than most public corporations post in profit. So ask the obvious question. How does one bloodline hold the same patch of ground, unbroken, for 11 generations, through 2 world wars, a century of taxation built specifically to break up estates like this one, and a scandal that once had all of London placing bets on whether the family would keep a single acre of it? The answer starts, strangely enough, not with a businessman, but with a frightened 12-year-old girl standing in a room in 1677, being married off to a man she had met perhaps twice. Her name was Mary Davies, and she did not build this fortune. She was born into it, almost by accident. Her family, the Davies and Audley line, held roughly 500 acres of land to the west of the city of London, and it was, at the time, nearly worthless. It was the manor of Avery, low-lying pasture and marsh, cut through by a stream, grazed by cattle, flooded half the year, valuable mainly because livestock could stand on it. Nobody in 1677 would have called this the richest piece of dirt in the British Isles. It looked like the edge of nowhere, a short muddy walk from the edge of a city that had only just finished rebuilding itself after the Great Fire 11 years earlier. The man chosen to marry into this muddy inheritance was Sir Thomas Grosvenor, a 21-year-old baronet from Cheshire, whose own family had already come close to losing everything once already. Decades earlier, during the English Civil War, the Grosvenors had backed the king, and when Cromwell's side won, their estate was seized outright. They only got it back by paying a fine to buy their way out of ruin. That detail matters because it means this family had already learned, once, what it feels like to have everything taken by a single political decision, and they carried that lesson into the next crisis without knowing one was coming. In 1677, the marriage went ahead. Mary Davies, 12 years old, became Dame Mary Grosvenor, and the muddy 500 acres passed, on paper, into the hands of her husband's family. For a few decades, nothing dramatic happened. The land sat there, undeveloped, worth little more than the rents from a handful of farmers. Sir Thomas built a life in Cheshire and in London. The family had children, 5 sons and 3 daughters, and the marshland waited. Then, in 1700, Sir Thomas Grosvenor died suddenly of a fever. He was 45, and Mary, at 35 years old, became one of the wealthiest widows in England, and by every surviving account, she also began to unravel. The historical record describes a woman who had already shown signs of what her family called volatile behavior in the years before her husband's death, and losing him seems to have accelerated it. She converted to Catholicism at a time when that alone made her vulnerable to accusations of instability in Protestant England, and she kept a personal chaplain, a Benedictine monk named Lodowick Fenwick, who had looked after her spiritual needs through her most fragile years. In June of 1701, Mary traveled to Paris, accompanied by Fenwick, and on the night of the 12th of June, in a hotel room on the Rue Saint-Dominique, Fenwick's brother, a man named Edward Fenwick, whom Mary had met only weeks before, entered her room after dark and did not leave until morning. The next day, it was announced to the household that the monk had married the two of them the night before, with two servants standing as witnesses. Mary Grosvenor, one of the richest widows in England, was now allegedly the wife of Edward Fenwick. Whether she consented, whether she was drugged, whether she even understood what had happened, is a question historians still argue about more than 300 years later. What is certain is what happened next. Mary fled back to London within weeks and denied the marriage outright, but Edward Fenwick did not go away. He began issuing formal demands for rent on Grosvenor properties along Millbank, acting exactly like a man who now owned a controlling interest in one of the largest private estates in England. Under the law of the time, a husband automatically gained control of his wife's property. If the marriage in that Paris hotel room was ruled valid, Edward Fenwick, a man nobody in the Grosvenor family had ever heard of a year earlier, would legally control the ground beneath what is now Mayfair. The family's response tells you everything about how seriously they understood the threat. They did not negotiate. In fear that Fenwick now held the legal standing to physically take control of Mary, they moved her out of London entirely, sending her to the family's Cheshire estate while lawyers prepared for war. And it was war. The case went to trial in April of 1703 in front of a jury in Westminster Hall, and the Grosvenor family lost. The jury ruled the Paris marriage valid. For a period afterward, Edward Fenwick had the law on his side, and the fate of 3 centuries of London real estate hung on an appeal. The family pressed on, arguing that Mary had not been of sound mind when the marriage supposedly took place, that she had been manipulated, possibly drugged, by men who had identified a vulnerable wealthy widow and moved in with practiced speed. A second hearing followed, at Sergeant's Inn, and this time the ruling went the other way. The court declared the Paris marriage null and void. Mary Grosvenor was ruled not of sound mind, declared, in the language of the era, a lunatic, and placed under permanent legal guardianship for the remainder of her life. The estate reverted to the family, to be managed by trustees on behalf of her children. Here is the part almost nobody tells you when they talk about the birth of modern Mayfair. The single most valuable piece of urban real estate in the world came within one jury verdict of legally passing into the hands of a fortune hunter who had known his supposed wife for 3 weeks. If that first trial's verdict had held on appeal, there would be no Grosvenor fortune to talk about at all. There would just be a footnote about an English conman who briefly outmarried everyone in history. Mary Davies spent the rest of her life in Cheshire, under guardianship, largely absent from the story of the land that still bears her legacy today. But the crisis she survived, or rather, that her family survived around her, taught the Grosvenors something that no other landed family of their era fully absorbed. Ownership concentrated in a single vulnerable person is not safety, it is exposure. One widow, alone, isolated, grieving, and newly rich, had nearly handed away 500 acres to a stranger in a single night. The family's answer to that lesson would not fully form for another 2.5 centuries, but the instinct started here, in a Cheshire estate where a woman the family loved was locked away to save land she would never see developed. With Mary's children now the legal heirs and the estate secured, the Grosvenors made the decision that separates this story from every other collapsing dynasty. They did not sell the land, they leased it. Starting in the early 1700s and accelerating through the 1720s, when the family began laying out Grosvenor Square, they adopted a building method that had existed before them, but that nobody had ever used at this scale. Developers and craftsmen were given long leases, typically 99 years, to build houses on Grosvenor land. The builders paid for construction. The builders sold or rented the finished houses. But the ground beneath every single one of those houses stayed, on paper, in Grosvenor hands, generating a ground rent every single year and reverting entirely back to the family when each lease expired. Think about what that means in practice. Every developer, every architect, every wealthy family that ever lived in a Mayfair townhouse across 3 centuries was, in effect, renting the dirt from the same bloodline. The houses changed hands constantly. The tenants changed every generation. The freehold never moved. This is the invisible engine underneath everything that followed. A family that sells land gets paid once. A family that leases land forever gets paid every single year, forever, and eventually gets the building back too. The 19th century only deepened the machine. Robert Grosvenor, later made Marquess of Westminster, expanded the strategy south and west into what became Belgravia and Pimlico, turning more marshland into more leased streets of white stucco terraces. By 1874, the family had grown so large in wealth and stature that Queen Victoria created a new title specifically for them, Duke of Westminster, the last dukedom ever granted outside the royal family itself. And through every one of those generations, the family kept doing the one thing almost no other English estate managed to do consistently. They passed the entire holding intact to a single heir, generation after generation, without splitting the freehold among multiple children the way so many aristocratic families did. It is worth pausing on how unusual that discipline is. Most great fortunes in history die exactly the way you have heard in other stories, split evenly among children out of a sense of fairness, thinned out generation after generation until nobody holds enough to matter. The Grosvenors did not do that with the land. Daughters, younger sons, and other relatives were provided for through other means, but the core estate, the freehold itself, moved as a single block from duke to duke, protected by legal structures known as strict settlements that made it extraordinarily difficult for any one heir to sell off pieces or gamble the estate away. In the 20th century, the family sharpened the machine even further. In the 1950s, facing a British tax system explicitly designed to break up large inherited estates through death duties, the Grosvenors placed the commercial core of their holdings into a series of trusts. This single decision is arguably the most important structural choice the family has made since the 1720s. A trust separates legal ownership from personal ownership. The Duke of Westminster does not personally own most of Mayfair and Belgravia the way you might own a house. He is the beneficiary and chairman of a set of trustees who hold and manage it on behalf of the family as an institution. That distinction sounds technical, but its effect is enormous. A trust cannot get divorced. A trust cannot gamble away the family's silver. A trust does not die and trigger inheritance tax the way an individual does. When the 6th Duke of Westminster died suddenly in 2016 at the age of 64, the title and control of the estate passed to his son Hugh, who was 25 years old at the time. And because the wealth sat inside trusts rather than in his father's personal name, the transition happened without the kind of tax event or forced liquidation that has broken apart nearly every comparable fortune in this kind of story. Compare that for a moment to the pattern this format has traced through other American dynasties. A founder builds something, the next generation splits it out of love or fairness or simple inattention. The pieces thin out. The family converts productive assets into palaces, yachts, and titles that produce nothing and cost everything. Then estate taxes, lawsuits, and pure fragmentation finish the job within 3 generations. The Grosvenors faced every single one of those pressures. They faced a near total loss of the entire estate to a stranger within 1 generation of acquiring it. They faced 2 world wars and a British tax code built with almost surgical precision to dismantle families exactly like theirs. And they answered every single threat the same way. Never split the core asset, never sell the freehold, only the use of it, and eventually protect the whole structure inside a legal shell that outlives any single person's mistakes. Today, the numbers tell you the result. The family's London holdings alone are valued at somewhere close to £10 billion, spread across roughly 300 acres and more than 1,500 individual properties, and that figure has grown steadily, even as the family diversified into offices, retail, and residential holdings across North America, continental Europe, and Asia, reducing its dependence on any single market the way a founder building an engine, rather than a monument, always eventually has to. None of it would exist if a jury in Westminster Hall in 1703 had simply let its first ruling stand. Somewhere in an alternate version of this story, Edward Fenwick's descendants are the ones who own Grosvenor Square today, and nobody remembers the name Grosvenor at all. Instead, a family that nearly lost everything to a fraudulent marriage and a vulnerable grieving widow learned, in the years that followed, exactly what it takes to make sure that no single person, no single generation, and no single stranger with a fast courtship can ever again hold the fate of the whole estate in one pair of hands. The mechanism was never brilliance, it was structure. Lease the ground, never sell it. Keep the core whole across every generation, and build a legal shield strong enough to survive the one thing every fortune eventually faces, a human being who is, for a moment, too vulnerable to protect it alone. 349 years later, the ground under Grosvenor Square has never once changed hands outside that same bloodline, and the family that almost lost it all in a Paris hotel room now owns more of central London than the government that once nearly let it slip away.